So while the entire internet is buzzing right now about the Switch 2, and rightfully so because that is pretty exciting, today I thought I would go a different direction and talk about the possibility of a Steam console. Now, I realize that in some ways the Steam Deck already serves this purpose considering it can be docked and all, but if recent rumors are to be believed and they continue to look more and more credible, there's a good chance we're going to get some more hardware from Valve specifically running Steam OS in 2025. And one of the things that's rumored to come out is that we're going to start seeing either natively produced Steam consoles from Valve, or that they'll just partner with third parties like Asus to go ahead and start putting Steam OS on some of their hardware to make a consoleized version of the Steam Deck experience we already enjoy. And if that is true, I thought it would be fun today to go ahead and talk about some of the things that I would want out of a console like that, because I am 100% on board with the idea of a Steam OS driven console. However, I think there are some very specific considerations we'd have to take into account if it's going to be a device that could truly challenge, Xbox and PlayStation for living room dominance. So with that in mind, today's kind of a wish list of sorts of the kind of features that I would like to see in a Steam OS driven console for your living room. And I figure in the typical way, we'll start from the outside and work our way in, starting with physical considerations for the box itself and things like pricing, before we move on to more nuanced considerations like how that software experience should be, and the kind of performance that you would want to get out of it to play games in your living room. Because while I'm sure a lot of people here love the Steam Deck, I'm sure that given the choice between sitting in front of your TV and playing something like Spider-Man 2 on the deck versus playing it on the PlayStation 5, I think most people would choose the latter just because obviously you're going to get a better experience there. But before we get too deep into that, let's just go ahead and start with the high-level considerations for a Steam console, and I think the most obvious starting point is the pricing. Now, personally, I think that a good price point for this would be somewhere between $399 and $599. And I'm okay with the idea of them offering multiple models, provided those different models have the same base power, but really just give things like, increased storage. I don't think it would be a good idea to go ahead and say like, okay, we've got like a Steam Console Pro versus a standard Steam console, because at that point I think people would start to wonder why not just buy a conventional console, or if we're really going to spend that much money on a Steam console, then really we're kind of getting into the place where why wouldn't I just consider desktop PC territory? And I think that'll be a tricky needle for them to thread, honestly, because, again, if they come in too cheap, then you're going to be looking at alternatives from like Nintendo, Sony, or Microsoft. But then if it's too expensive, again, you might just consider, why wouldn't I just build a gaming rig at this price point if I'm going to go north of like $600 or $700 or something? So yeah, if we're talking about an actual Valve manufactured console and not just SteamOS being on some, partner's device, I think that $399 to $599 is the sweet spot, and I think $599 really should be the upper limit for that, because if I learned anything from PlayStation in 2005 at E3, it's that $599 can be kind of dicey, even today. So next up, let's talk about some physical considerations for the console itself and what that would look like. And one of the first things that I would be concerned with is just how large this console is going to be, right? To some degree, you're kind of bound by the laws of thermodynamics. If you want like a big, beefy graphics card, well, that's going to consume a lot of power and throw out a lot of heat, which is naturally going to make the system need to be a little bit bigger. So as far as how large that footprint should be, I think they should shoot for something that is somewhere between the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5, ideally closer to the Xbox Series X, because I still remember how ridiculous it was when those systems first came out, and IKEA was actually, basically putting out mocked up, models of the PlayStation 5 and Xbox to make sure it would fit in their furniture. I love the PlayStation 5, but I still have my original one, and it's just so big and unwieldy, it doesn't easily fit into most furniture, so that would definitely be something that I'd be concerned with, and, if I had, just complete control over what one of these systems should look like, I think closer to the Xbox Series X would probably be ideal. And something else when it comes to the physical considerations is that, like both the Xbox and the PlayStation 5, I think it should allow for both vertical and horizontal orientation, but if we are going to talk about the physical form factor and how it should be oriented, whether that's vertically or horizontally, or ideally both, so it can accommodate a range of different living room furniture types, I hope that if they do either, that it doesn't require like a weird little stand to make that work, because I was not a fan of the PlayStation 5's initial stand, and even less so of like that tiny plastic clip that they use in the revised models that have come out since the original PS5 model. Now, putting aside the size and form factor and orientation, when it comes to physical buttons on the outside of a Steam console, personally I would opt for only two buttons. One, a physical power button, and two, a button for easily pairing Bluetooth controllers. And honestly, both of those buttons need to be differentiated by touch, either because they're different sizes, or they have different textures, or they have different LED lights that make it very clear which one is which, because there have been systems in the past, like the original PlayStation 3, where it wasn't really clear which button you were hitting, and while I recognize that having physical buttons might detract from a sleek design, and I certainly appreciate sleek designs. I don't appreciate sleek design that comes at the expense of usability, because that's how you get Apple mice that have charging ports on the bottom, making it unusable while it charges, which is dumb. Now let's talk about I/O options and expandable storage for a second, because as far as ports for this system, I think an HDMI port is obviously a given here, but I don't think it would hurt also to go ahead and give it a display port as well, because even though this might be a console that's designed for the living room, there will certainly be people like me who would also likely be able to set it up in a desktop environment, and the idea of hooking it up to multiple monitors might be preferable, especially if, you are still able to jump in the desktop mode, which is a common feature of SteamOS today. And outside of the video ports that it's equipped with, as far as data goes, I think it needs to have at least one front-facing USB-C port, and at the rear at least two USB-C ports and two USB-A ports, because even though USB-A has largely fallen out of fashion in favor of USB-C, there are still a lot of people with devices, peripherals, and cables for charging their controllers that use the USB-A port. That being said, regardless of the connection type for USB, I think every one of them should be high speed, like USB 3.1 or 3.2. I believe that's the way it is on the Steam Deck dock now, and the reason for that is simple. I don't want to have to do any mental math when I'm trying to plug in a peripheral or a controller to try to remember, hey, is this just for power or is this going to be really slow for data? Just make them all fast. And while we're talking about speedy data ports that should be on a system like this, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that it should have support for an external GPU. Now, personally, I would never use an external GPU. That would just go completely against what I want for my console-ized experience, but I know there are people out there who prefer to use these, and it would provide some additional scalability in the future if people are looking to get more power out of the system while they wait for the next model of it to come out. Again, we're talking about like Valve manufactured hardware here, not necessarily like third parties that are making devices. I'm just talking about a dream scenario where Valve goes ahead and makes a system like they did with the Steam Deck, where it's sort of like, their official version of a Steam console. And if we're talking speedy data access, I think it would also be great if it did have an easily accessible NVMe slot. We can kind of do that with the PlayStation 5 now and expand its storage by putting in an internal SSD if we would like to, but I think the same should be available for any hardware that Valve puts out for a Steam console experience, because, that's pretty much the gold standard right now. People want really, really fast access to their games and the ability to load in assets quickly, so I think including an easily accessible panel for this either at the bottom of the system or at the rear of the system is a no-brainer. And finally, even though I think it's slightly fallen out of favor, I do think it would be nice to have at least a micro SD card slot, since a lot of people are already used to using this with their Steam Decks anyways. Plus, I don't think we've really seen a lot of mainstream consoles have an SD card reader. I think we've only seen like 4 major ones, right? Like the Wii, Wii U, the original PlayStation 3, and I guess the Nintendo Switch, on the Steam Deck. But yeah, I still think SD cards are really useful. It's a really cheap storage technology, and even though it's great to have super fast access from an SSD for some games that are very resource intensive, there are plenty of games out there that don't necessarily require that kind of speed, and SD cards are still a really cheap, easy to access medium. So outside of the form factor and the ports and the hardware I think should be included for the system itself, let's talk about accessories that I think should be included, and there aren't a ton, but there are 2 that I think would be nice. One would be a really well done controller, which I believe they are already working on as a successor to one of their earlier Steam controller designs, but ideally I would want it to have all of the functionality that a standard controller has now, whether that's the PS5 DualSense or the Xbox Series controllers, but then also make sure it has at least one set of rear paddles, since I think a lot of Steam Deck fans have kind of gotten used to having 2 sets of paddles at the rear. But then also I think there should definitely be a touchpad on this controller, and the only reason I say that is because no matter how much they try to make it a consoleized experience, if it's running SteamOS, I know from experience playing it with the Steam Deck that sooner or later you're going to hit like a launcher or some kind of an error message or something that's going to pop up where you're going to need a mouse and keyboard to interact with it, and ideally, if it can be avoided, I would love to be able to do that directly from the controller rather than have to keep a mouse and Bluetooth keyboard in my living room to deal with these really weird edge scenarios as they occur. And if you're going to include a controller that serves those normal console functions, but then also gives you a little bit of extra flexibility with a touchpad, and you've got this nice new approach to bringing Steam games into your living room more effectively, then I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that you ask for an extra long USB-C braided cable to charge that, and really just drive home the point that yes, you are thinking of people who are playing in a living room, because ostensibly this would be the scenario that Valve's aiming to address by releasing a SteamOS based console in the first place. Now, as far as the OS and usability and just additional features that I would add for a living room specific console from Valve, I don't know that there's a ton I could really expand upon here. I mean, most of us already kind of know what to expect from using SteamOS on the Steam Deck, but I guess it would be nice if they did anything they could to just make it a little bit more friendly to the living room, because again, in stark contrast to having a handheld device, we're talking about something where you're going to be using predominantly a controller for input and likely be situated further away from the console than if you were playing a Steam Deck in portable mode, or if you had it in like docked mode on a desktop or something like that. The only other quirky thing I can think of from a software perspective that I think would be cool to include would be maybe just like a free game, but not one that's just a random free game from the Steam Marketplace. Rather, it would be neat if they just had like a simple, lightweight experience, maybe Portal themed like they did with Aperture Desk Job, just to get people excited to, fire up the system for the first time and experience something new. Now, as far as the power profile and how well this thing can actually run games, I'm not really equipped to speak to this in a technical way. I'm not Digital Foundry or anything. The only thing that I can say is that in a general way, for just like casual people who are considering buying this device, I think they should be, baseline shooting for at least what the PlayStation 5 base model does, because that's a really powerful system, and when I play games on it in my living room, it looks really good. It's not perfect, not every game is running at 4K 60 native or anything like that, but it's good enough that I never worry about popping a game into my PS5 and how well it's going to run. It looks pretty gorgeous every time. Again, to my less nuanced eye, I'm sure for more eagle-eyed players out there who are more technically minded, they may have a more discerning eye when it comes to the video output from something like the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X and see things that don't necessarily look that great. But I would say for the average, or dare I say casual player, that generally speaking, when you fire up either of those systems, it's going to look pretty good, and I think that's what they should be aiming for with a Steam console. And I know a lot of what I've talked about today are pretty standard features that we've come to expect from a gaming console, but again, this is sort of a unique situation, right? This is not strictly speaking a console, rather it is a consoleized PC experience that is using SteamOS to circumvent the normal restrictions we would have from something like Windows, or the relative, kind of locked in feel that you get from a traditional console like the PlayStation 5 or the Nintendo Switch. So naturally, a lot of these elements are going to be exactly the same, but I do think Valve has a real opportunity here to just show the world what a living room PC can be like, where it really does take the best elements of both worlds and combines them into an affordable package that most people can enjoy and really experience their Steam games in an entirely new way. But again, this is just one guy's opinion. What do you think about the idea of a Steam console? What's on your personal wish list for the price point, form factor, special features, the kind of performance you're expecting? I would love to hear what you think about it, especially if you're somebody who's old hat at PC gaming and has a more nuanced perspective on the technical pieces than I do. But that's it for this one. As far as what's coming up on the channel, I am working on a community video where I play some of the games that you recommended, and then I'm also working on a pickups video for some games that I just, grabbed after the winter sale and all that, so, keep an eye out for that. As always, thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch videos here. It means a ton to me. Have an amazing day, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.